I want you to imagine just finding this beautiful, like centuries old, handwritten love letter up in an attic.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, and it's delicate, the ink is completely faded, and there's just this profound sweeping emotion behind the words. But,
There's always a but.
right, so now imagine taking that letter, and instead of actually reading the words to understand the soul of the person who wrote it, you spend the rest of your life putting it under a microscope.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Like, you measure the exact chemical composition of the ink, you calculate the microscopic dimensions of the paper fibers.
Maybe analyze the molecular structure of the wax seal.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And eventually you possess 100% of the empirical data about that piece of paper, but you have lost literally 100% of its meaning.
That is, I mean, that's such a tragic image.
It is. And today we're taking a deep dive into a historical mystery that asks a rather unsettling question. Like, is that exactly what Western science did to the universe?
Yeah, and that analogy, it really cuts right to the heart of what we are unpacking today.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you stand at the edge of a major modern city, looking at a river that's been engineered into this straight concrete channel.
Yeah, just totally paved over.
Right. Or when you feel that strange modern alienation of being hyper-connected to devices but totally severed from the natural world,
Yeah.
it is incredibly easy to assume that this is just the non-negotiable price of progress.
We're basically conditioned to view history as this single, unavoidable track.
We are. From the first spark of human curiosity straight to the smartphone in your hand, we assume this relentless drive to quantify and dominate nature was like the absolute only way science could have ever evolved.
But what if that straight line is just, well, an illusion? What if there was a completely alternate path, like a profound fork in the road of human consciousness that we walked right past?
And that's exactly what we're looking at today.
Right, because we are pulling heavily today from Seyyed Hossein Nasr's fascinating work, Traditional Islamic Science and Western Science. And our mission for this deep dive is to trace this massive divergence.
It really is a massive divergence.
We want to understand why the scientific traditions of the West and the Islamic world, which actually started with the exact same ancient blueprints.
The exact same library of knowledge.
Right, how they ended up creating fundamentally different versions of reality. So we're going to look at this massive philosophical earthquake in the 14th century, the literal eviction of angels from the cosmos.
Which is such a wild concept to wrap your head around today.
It really is. And finally, the shift from seeking spiritual wisdom to seeking worldly power.
And exploring this divergence, I mean, it requires us to completely dismantle the assumption that the East and the West were just these isolated bubbles.
Yeah, that they were totally separate worlds.
Exactly. To really understand the magnitude of this split, you have to look at the sheer volume of their shared Mediterranean heritage. I mean, they were drinking from the exact same ancient wells.
Which is something I feel like we forget.
We completely forget it. Islam didn't just inherit, a few stray Greek manuscripts. They absorbed nearly the entire corpus of Aristotelian science.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. Because we throw around terms like ancient heritage, and it can sound like a vague, dusty museum exhibit.
Right, just marble statues.
Yeah. What exactly was in this library they were both pulling from? Because it wasn't just Aristotle sitting alone in a room writing everything down.
Far from it. When we talk about this shared foundation, we're talking about centuries of synthesized brilliance. The Islamic world integrated the works of Aristotle's Alexandrian commentators.
And who were they exactly?
These were the later scholars in places like Alexandria who spent generations unpacking, refining, and preserving Aristotelian logic and physics. And they absorbed Platonic cosmology, too.
Wow.
Yeah, and the medical masterworks from centers like Pergamon. And even the more esoteric, mystical strands of Greek thought, like Pythagoreanism and Hermeticism.
And what blows my mind is that the Islamic scholars didn't just act as a Greek storage unit, They were an active intellectual crossroads.
Oh, absolutely. They were synthesizing everything.
Nasr points out they pulled in Sassan astronomy, like the incredibly precise astronomical tables from the Persian Empire. They brought in Indian mathematics, Indian medicine, concepts of zero and decimals.
The zero is a huge one.
Huge. And they absorbed Babylonian observational sciences that had never even reached the Greeks, and even integrated elements of Chinese science, particularly in alchemy. I mean, it was the ultimate unprecedented ancient super library.
A super library that was, actively being expanded. And here is the crucial historical mechanism that often gets glossed over.
Oh, about how it reached Europe.
Exactly. Much of this ancient Greek and global knowledge did not reach Christian Europe directly. The Latin West essentially became the heir to this massive repository of knowledge through Islamic science.
Right, because after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Europe kind of lost a lot of its Greek.
He did.
They didn't have the original texts just sitting around in Paris or London.
Precisely. The transmission happened largely via these massive translation movements, most famously in Toledo, Spain, during the 11th and 12th centuries.
I love the image of Toledo at this time.
It's incredible. Just imagine the scene in Toledo. It was this newly conquered cosmopolitan city where Mozarabs, Jewish scholars, and Christian monks were all sitting side by side.
Just working together on these ancient texts.
Yeah, they were taking these dense, brilliant Arabic treatises, which already contained Greek, Persian, and Indian wisdom, right?
Yeah.
And translating them aloud into the local Romance vernacular, and then translating that into Latin for the rest of Europe.
It's such an incredible image. It's essentially two siblings inheriting the exact same vast ancient library.
That's a great way to put it.
And, if you give two brilliant students the exact same data, the same foundational theories, you would expect them to write very similar thesis papers. And for a long time, the historical record shows that they actually did.
It really did.
By the 13th century, medieval European science was developing on a completely parallel track to Islamic science.
You see this profound alignment when you look at medieval European titans like Albertus Magnus or the scholars at the School of Chartres, or Robert Grosseteste.
Grosseteste is a perfect example.
He really is. He was an English statesman, scholastic philosopher, and eventually the Bishop of Lincoln in the 13th century.
Mm.
And he wrote this famous treatise called De Luce, or On Light.
Let's hover on Grosseteste for a second, because his worldview perfectly captures what both the Islamic and Western worlds were doing at the time. Like, what was he actually arguing in on light?
So Grosseteste argued that light was the very first form created by God, and that all physical matter in the universe was essentially just condensed, crystallized light.
Wow. Condensed light.
Yeah. For him, the study of optics, measuring angles of refraction, studying lenses, understanding how light propagates, wasn't just a physical experiment. It was literal theology.
Right, because by studying light, you were studying the first instrument of divine creation.
Exactly. You were looking at God's tools.
So optics was this deeply spiritual pursuit, and that perfectly encapsulates the shared goal. For both Islamic scholars and medieval Western scholars, the sciences of nature were not just about, cataloging random facts.
No, not at all.
The study of the physical world was a means to discover the wisdom of God. Whether you were mapping the orbit of a planet or dissecting a plant, you were trying to read the divine signature written into creation.
And what's fascinating here is that when you look at that beautiful shared starting line, it's actually deeply shocking that Europe eventually produced a Descartes or a Galileo, while the Islamic world and China did not.
It really makes you pause and reevaluate everything.
Because we are so conditioned by a Eurocentric view of history to think that the scientific revolution was just the natural, inevitable crowning achievement of human intelligence. Like, if you are smart enough, eventually you build a mechanical factory.
Right, like it's just the next level in the video game of civilization.
Exactly. But Nasr asks us to flip that assumption entirely on its head. He argues that the mechanical, quantitative scientific revolution wasn't an inevitable upgrade. It was the result of a massive philosophical erosion.
A series of negative factors that systematically destroyed the traditional Christian cosmos in the West.
Yes, and to figure out why the West took such a hard left turn, we have to look at a philosophical shift in the 14th century that literally mutilated the traditional worldview.
Okay, mutilated is a really strong word.
It is a strong word, but historically accurate for the sheer scale of the paradigm shift.
So how did it get mutilated?
Well, in the Middle Ages, Christianity shared a worldview with Islam that was deeply rooted in metaphysical knowledge. The source refers to this as the sapiential or Gnostic dimension.
Meaning what, exactly?
It's the idea that true knowledge isn't just empirical data you gather with your eyes and hands, It's a profound inner wisdom that directly connects the physical realm to higher, spiritual realities.
And this wasn't some fringe underground belief in Europe either. This sapiential tradition was the mainstream intellectual lifeblood.
Completely mainstream.
You see it towering in the poetry of Dante, the mysticism of Meister Eckhart, the brilliant cosmology of Nicholas of Cusa. But then we hit the 14th century and the rise of a philosophical movement called nominalism.
Ah, nominalism.
Yeah, and Nasr argues this was the fatal blow to that shared worldview. Let me see if I can explain this, because nominalism can feel incredibly dense to modern ears, but it's really the fulcrum of this whole mystery.
Go for it. Let's break down the actual mechanics of this philosophical war.
Okay, so before nominalism, the dominant view in both Christian and Islamic theology, which they heavily adapted from Plato, right?
Yes, very Platonic.
Right. It was that universals or archetypes had a real higher existence. So if you or I walk outside and look at an oak tree, we aren't just seeing a random, meaningless collection of wood and leaves.
We are seeing a physical, earthly reflection of the divine idea of a tree.
Exactly. The physical object is literally anchored to a metaphysical reality. And human intelligence, our minds, have the innate capacity to perceive those higher realities through the physical world.
You've nailed the baseline. The physical world was porous. It breathed with higher meaning. But enter nominalism in the 14th century.
Led by William of Ockham.
Yes, heavily championed by figures like William of Ockham, the guy famous for Occam's razor. Nominalists looked at this Platonic setup and argued that these universals or higher archetypes don't actually exist outside the human mind.
They claimed that concepts like tree or humanity or beauty or just names, nomina in Latin, that's literally where we get the word nominalism.
Exactly. They argued these are just convenient linguistic labels we invent to group similar things together for our own sanity. They have no higher metaphysical reality whatsoever.
But why? Like, why would Occam and others argue this? It wasn't because they hated religion, right?
Ironically, it was a defense mechanism.
Yeah.
They wanted to protect the absolute unbridled freedom of God.
Protect God from what?
From being boxed in. They worried that if universals truly existed, then God would be bound by them. If the idea of a tree exists eternally, God has to follow the rules of a tree to make one.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, nominalists wanted a God who could do absolutely anything, unrestricted by any pre-existing archetypes or blueprints.
That is such a crucial piece of the puzzle. They were trying to defend God's omnipotence, but in doing so, they accidentally severed the anchor rope.
They absolutely did.
By declaring that the physical world had no actual tether to spiritual archetypes, they cut the physical realm entirely off from the spiritual realm.
And the consequences of that theological defense mechanism were absolute devastation for medieval Christian ontology, the fundamental study of being.
Because if the physical world doesn't reflect a higher reality, then human intelligence can't use the physical world to grasp metaphysical truths.
Exactly. Nominalism asserted that religious truth could only be known entirely through blind faith, totally divorced from knowledge or reason.
They essentially split faith and reason into two completely separate airtight boxes.
Which created a catastrophic vacuum. Without that metaphysical connection, the traditional sciences, which relied entirely on the porous boundary between the physical and the divine, suddenly became opaque.
They just stopped making sense.
Right. If studying the angle of light doesn't actually tell you anything about God, what is the point of studying optics?
It's just geometry at that point.
Exactly. This vacuum was rapidly filled by rationalism, empiricism, and eventually Cartesian dualism, the philosophy of René Descartes that completely, surgically separated the thinking mind from the dead, mechanical matter of the physical world.
Okay, wait, I have to jump in and push back here because this directly contradicts almost everything we are taught in standard Western education.
I know, it really does.
We are universally taught that the Renaissance, which bubbles up right after the shift, was a monumental awakening. It was the rebirth of human knowledge, art, and science out of the so-called Dark Ages.
The standard narrative, yeah.
So how can Nasr or anyone looking at the historical record justify calling the intrusion of Renaissance humanism a mutilation that actually lowered our intellectual ceiling?
It's a completely valid friction point,
Yeah.
and it's arguably the most controversial part of Nasr's thesis for a Western audience.
Yeah, people love the Renaissance.
We view the Renaissance as an awakening because we gained immense, unprecedented knowledge about the physical mechanics of the world. We mapped the stars, we mapped the human circulatory system, we developed incredible engineering.
Which is all true.
It is true. But Nasr introduces the concept of a monumental trade-off.
A trade-off between what and what?
Between the newly formed Western intelligentsia, discovering a new Earth, and losing heaven. The West developed quantitative science, which allowed them to measure, predict, and manipulate the physical realm with a precision that was, frankly, staggering.
Right.
But the argument goes, they gained this new Earth at the catastrophic cost of losing an infinitely superior qualitative understanding of reality.
So, going back to the intro, we got the precise measurements of the love letter, but we completely lost the ability to read the emotion.
I would take that even further, honestly.
Yeah.
It wasn't just that we lost the ability, we actively decided the emotion didn't exist.
Oh, wow.
Because of this nominalist and rationalist shift, anything that pointed to a higher spiritual reality in nature was actively demoted. Science was fundamentally subverted.
So it went from being wisdom to just data.
Yeah, the traditional knowledge that had once been considered the highest form of human wisdom was now sneered at as mere conjecture or poetic fantasy. If a type of knowledge didn't fit into the new, purely physical, measurable paradigm, it was dismissed as superstition.
So it wasn't a universal awakening, it was a hyper-focusing. We awakened to one specific, highly narrow slice of reality, the quantitative, while going completely blind to the qualitative spiritual dimension.
Exactly.
That is deeply unsettling. And what's fascinating is that this loss of higher reality didn't just change how scholars argued in the dusty halls of Oxford or Paris. It fundamentally changed the psychology of the average person.
That psychological shift is perhaps the most tragic part of the historical record.
Because it changed how people literally saw the world around them.
Right. In the medieval period, Europeans possessed what Nasr calls a symbolist spirit. This wasn't just an artistic preference for, painting halos on saints. It was their fundamental, hardwired way of processing reality.
They understood natural phenomena like a violent thunderstorm, a towering mountain, the cyclical death and rebirth of the seasons as literal symbols of higher truths.
There is this beautiful Latin phrase for this, vestigia Dei, the vestiges or the footprints of God in the world.
I love that, tracking the footprints of the divine.
Yeah. When a medieval person looked at nature, they weren't seeing isolated random occurrences. Think about the construction of a medieval cathedral.
Okay, yeah.
When you or I look at the Cathedral of Chartres today, we admire the load-bearing engineering of the flying buttresses, the chemical composition of the stained glass, the architectural audacity.
Right, the mechanics of it.
But to the medieval mind, a cathedral wasn't just a big building meant to hold a lot of people. It was a literal physical expression of the sacred science of the cosmos.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because every single geometry in that cathedral, every angle of light designed to hit the altar at a specific time of year.
Every proportional ratio between the nave and the transept.
Exactly. It was all designed to reflect divine cosmic order. Walking into the cathedral was supposed to guide the soul toward that higher reality by physically surrounding it with sacred mathematics.
But as rationalism took a stranglehold on the Western mind, it blinded us to this symbolism. And it's crucial to understand the profound difference between a symbol and a sign here.
Okay, what's the difference?
A sign just points to a flat fact. A red octagon means stop. A cloud means rain. But a symbol participates in the reality it points to. It carries layers of profound, inexhaustible meaning.
So rationalism turns symbols into signs.
Yes, the rationalist mindset reduced the rich, multi-layered symbols of the natural world to mere signs and brute facts. Nature went from being a profound text filled with divine poetry to a basic utilitarian parts manual.
And the historical record shows this literalism happening on two fronts simultaneously, right?
It does.
As the symbolic understanding of the book of nature died, there was a parallel massive drop in sapiential, wisdom-seeking commentaries on sacred scripture.
Everything became literal.
Both the natural world and the religious texts were reduced to their most literal, external, superficial meanings. They became flat.
Completely flat. Nature was no longer a text to be read for spiritual insight. It was just a collection of empirical data to be quantified mathematically.
Now, there were a few individuals who tried to fight this tide, right?
There were. You have figures like Jacob Boehme in the 17th century. He was a German shoemaker and mystic who tried desperately to cultivate a symbolic, deeply spiritual science of nature.
But what happened to Boehme? He wasn't exactly embraced by the scientific community.
Oh, he was pushed to the absolute fringes. He was marginalized, mocked, and kept completely outside the mainstream of both the scientific and theological thought of his day.
So they just wrote him off entirely.
Yep. What was left in the mainstream was a purely literal interpretation of religion standing face to face with a purely quantitative science of nature.
And because of that literalism, science no longer had any relation to religion whatsoever, except in forms of outright confrontation like Galileo and the Church, or sheer mutual indifference.
The physical world was utterly, surgically stripped of its spiritual dimension.
But, okay, wait. If you strip the spiritual meaning from the physical world, if the universe is no longer a canvas of divine symbols reflecting the mind of God, who or what is running the universe?
That is the million-dollar question.
Because to fully embrace this new, purely literal science, the West had to do some massive cosmic house cleaning. They had to evict some very important, ancient tenets from the universe.
We're talking about the eviction of the angels.
I am. We are transitioning from a cosmos guided by divine will to a universe running on mechanical gears.
Right.
If you go back to the early Middle Ages, the Christian cosmos was vibrantly alive. It was practically vibrating with spiritual entities. You see this in the profound cosmic visions of writers like John Scotus Erigena, Hugo of St. Victor, and Hildegard of Bingen.
The universe was an organism animated by spiritual forces.
Yes, and this was totally in sync with the Islamic world at the time.
It was. Consider the towering Islamic philosopher Ibn Sina, known in the Latin West as Avicenna. For Avicenna, cosmology and angelology were completely, totally inseparable.
You couldn't explain the physics of how the universe worked without angels.
Exactly.
But let's clarify that, because modern ears hear angels and we picture, cute babies with wings sitting on clouds playing harps. But that's not what Avicenna meant at all.
Not even close. In this traditional framework, angels were the active, intellectual agents that carried out God's commands. They were the souls of the spheres.
They were the metaphysical engines that literally gave the cosmos its life, its order, and its movement.
They were the physics of the spiritual realm manifesting in the physical.
But the Latin West made a very specific, critical choice here. While they avidly read Avicenna, they eventually favored the philosophy of another brilliant Islamic thinker, Ibn Rushd.
Known as Averroes.
Right, and Averroes had a very different take on the mechanics of the heavens.
He did. In Averroes' system, those vibrant souls of the spheres, the angelic substances that moved the heavens out of love and obedience to God, were dispensed with.
They were just gone.
They were replaced by sterile, abstract intelligences. It was a subtle philosophical shift, but a monumental one. By the 13th century, the dominant scholastic thinkers in the West began brushing aside Avicenna's angels in favor of Averroes' sterile intelligences.
They were beginning the long philosophical process of desacralizing the cosmos. Let me stop you there, because I'm putting myself in the shoes of someone living in Europe at this time. Did everyday people, like the farmers, the blacksmiths, the merchants, did they just wake up one Tuesday and decide to stop believing in angels?
Right, like they suddenly look up at the sky and think, ah, yes, the sterile intelligences are moving the planets now.
Yeah. Did that happen?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it's vital to understand the nuance here. No, the everyday person did not stop believing. Ordinary men and women continued to revere angels, to pray for their protection, to believe in their vivid presence for centuries afterward.
Okay, that makes sense.
But, and this is the critical distinction that changed history, the vision of nature in the minds of the European intellectual elite had already shifted.
The theologians, the early philosophers, the university men?
Yes. For them, angels were no longer metaphysically necessary to explain how the universe ran. It's the profound difference between believing angels exist as a matter of personal, private faith versus believing they are the actual fundamental physics engine of the universe.
That is a staggering realization. Once you decide that you don't need spiritual forces to explain the movement of the stars or the changing of the seasons, the universe becomes philosophically prepared to be viewed as a giant mechanical clock.
And that metaphor of the clock is not accidental. Nasr points out that the fascination with mechanical clocks with gears and springs and predictable sterile motion was already deeply rooted in Europe long before Galileo wrote his Discorsi or Newton wrote his Principia.
So the mindset was already mechanical.
Exactly.
So the narrative we are usually fed that the scientific revolution happened and that is what killed the sacred cosmos is actually backward.
Completely backward.
The sacred cosmos was philosophically abandoned first. The spiritual void was already there. Newton and Galileo just came along and filled that pre-existing void with brilliant math.
The scientific revolution simply provided the mathematical equations for a clockwork universe that Western theology and philosophy had already agreed to build.
Wow. And once the universe is just a giant ticking machine, and humans are no longer contemplating its divine symbols, the entire goal of human interaction with nature drastically changes.
Of course it does.
If nature isn't a mirror reflecting God, but just a machine made of parts, what do you do with it? You take it apart. You use it.
You extract from it.
Right. The goal goes from inner perfection to outward domination. And I think nothing illustrates this ideological pivot more perfectly than looking at what happened to alchemy.
Alchemy is the perfect case study here. Today, if you say the word alchemy, people picture a bunch of greedy, delusional medieval guys in dark basements trying to get rich by magically turning lead into gold.
Yeah, just trying to make a quick buck.
Right. But true alchemy, in both the Islamic world and the early West, was profoundly different.
Because true alchemy was based on the correspondence between the microcosm, the human being, and the macrocosm, the universe.
Yes, as above, so below.
Exactly. Transmuting base metal into gold wasn't an ancient get-rich-quick scheme. It was a profound symbol. The physical chemical process happening in the crucible was meant to mirror an inner spiritual process happening within the alchemist.
The real goal was transmuting the base, fallen, chaotic human soul into the pure, luminous gold of sanctity.
It was an inner transformation.
Yes, the physical work with metals was contained within a strict matrix of tradition, deeply protected by the sacred. It wasn't about controlling the elements to dominate the world. It was about aligning yourself with the elements to perfect your soul.
So what does this all mean for the divergence we are tracking? As the Western worldview shifted to the mechanical, and as mercantilism and early capitalism began to rise, a massive rebellion took shape.
People started pushing back.
Modern Westerners began to rebel against the traditional Christian image of humans as fallen beings who were just temporary aliens in this earthly world, striving for heaven. They decided they wanted this world.
And the age of exploration dawned.
But as the historical record shows, it was fundamentally an age of exploitation.
The new explicit mandate of science was no longer to understand God. It was to explore, dominate, and exploit nature. Nasr uses a really visceral, telling phrase to describe this new attitude.
What does he say?
The goal was to tear her riches from her bosom.
Wow.
Yeah. Science became entirely wedded to power, utility, and physical control.
I try to visualize this shift, and I keep coming back to the difference between a gym and a bulldozer.
Oh, I like that.
Like, traditional Islamic science and early Western science was like a gymnasium for the soul. The heavy lifting, whether it was a complex study of the stars, the rigorous mathematics, or the alchemy, that physical and mental work was meant to build inner spiritual strength and bring you closer to the divine.
You're working on yourself.
Right. But modern Western science turned into a massive, diesel-powered bulldozer. It became purely focused on moving external dirt, leveling the landscape, extracting resources, and building earthly empires.
You aren't building your soul anymore. You're just extracting raw materials.
Exactly. And we cannot ignore the historical consequences of replacing the gym with the bulldozer. Because as you noted earlier, the bulldozer is terribly effective at moving dirt.
It is deeply effective. In the Islamic world, science remained intimately related to wisdom. Its utility was always viewed in the light of humans as immortal beings with eternal spiritual needs.
But in the West, science wedded itself to power and wealth.
It began viewing humans as purely earthly creatures whose only real needs were animalistic food, shelter, comfort, wealth, and extended lifespans.
And when a civilization armed with a quantitative bulldozing science encounters a civilization still operating within a qualitative spiritual framework, the results are historically devastating.
They are. This new quantitative science, totally focused on power and mechanical manipulation, provided an overwhelming military, industrial, and technological advantage to the West.
Which changed the whole balance of the world.
Absolutely. With this power, the West was able to colonize most of the Islamic world. It violently disrupted and destroyed much of the homogeneous Islamic civilization that had been developing parallel to it for all those centuries.
And it wasn't just a physical colonization, it was an intellectual colonization.
That is perhaps the more insidious consequence. The West imposed a Eurocentric view on the entire globe. The idea that modern, quantitative Western science is the only valid way to understand reality.
It just erased other ways of knowing.
Right. For centuries, the intellectually colonized East accepted this, viewing Western science as the ultimate, crowning achievement of all humanity, and viewing their own traditional sciences as backward myths.
We are absolutely living in the world the bulldozer built today. The unprecedented environmental devastation, the existence of weapons of mass destruction, the profound, aching sense of alienation from the natural world.
It's everywhere.
But as we map this out, a glaring question naturally arises. If this mechanical, exploitative science was so brutally contrary to the traditional spiritual worldview, why didn't Western religions step in to stop this total takeover of nature?
That's the real paradox, isn't it? Like, where were the theologians when the bulldozers started rolling?
This brings us to a critical theological blind spot in the West. Nasr argues that the vulnerability that allowed this to happen was actually baked into Western theology very, very early on.
How early?
If you go back to the Greco-Roman period, early Christianity was surrounded by paganism. They were terrified of naturalism and cosmolatry.
Cosmolatry?
Yeah, the pagan practice of worshiping the cosmos itself, worshiping the sun, the trees, the rivers.
Okay. So, to protect the faith from paganism, the early Latin church fathers drew an incredibly rigid, hard line between nature and supernature.
They really did.
They essentially pushed God out of the physical world to rigorously protect his transcendence. They were trying to say, don't worship the tree, worship the God who made the tree. But the unintended consequence of that rigid defense was that they accidentally stripped the tree of any inherent theological value. Mainstream Catholic theology simply didn't concern itself with nature as a profound spiritual text in the same way that Islam or even Judaism did.
Nature was just a backdrop for the human drama of sin and salvation.
Exactly. Now, there were exceptions, right? We mentioned Hildegard of Bingen earlier.
Yes, there were brilliant exceptions. St. Francis of Assisi singing the Canticle of the Sun, calling the moon his sister, or the development of Christian Hermeticism.
But these remained exceptions. They never became the dominant, driving theological operating system of the West.
So when the scientific revolution arrived in the 16th and 17th centuries, bringing its mechanical, sterile view of the universe, Western religion put up very little fight regarding the natural world.
Religion essentially handed over the keys to the physical universe. It retreated. The implicit agreement was, you, the scientists, handle the atoms, the gravity, and the commerce, and we, the church, will handle human morality and getting souls to the afterlife.
Wow. They just surrendered the realm of nature to quantitative science.
Completely. But in Islam, the trajectory was fundamentally different. The sacred character of God's creation continued to dominate their intellectual horizons.
Because they never made that split.
Right. Nasr points to later philosophical figures like Agro Aden Shirazi, who is a fascinating contrast because he was actually a contemporary of Descartes.
Think about that parallel. While Descartes in Europe is busy slicing the universe and half-dividing the thinking mind from the dead machine of the body, what is Shirazi doing in the Islamic world?
Shirazi is adding profound, expansive new chapters to the Islamic philosophy of nature, keeping it deeply integrated with the spiritual. In the Islamic world, the mathematical and physical sciences were continuously studied in the bosom of the symbolic sciences.
You see this integration physically manifested in their civilization. Look at the incredible development of five-fold symmetry in Islamic architecture.
It's breathtaking.
The civilization that built the Shah Mosque of Isfahan or the Taj Mahal in India was obviously not mathematically or scientifically illiterate. They possessed incredible, highly advanced traditional technology.
But they applied that technology within a worldview based on harmony with nature and an acute awareness of its spiritual significance. It wasn't about dominating the landscape. It was about utilizing geometry and physics to reflect heaven on earth.
But because of this massive divergence, because the West chose the path of the bulldozer, the modern world is now facing unprecedented crises.
We really are.
Nasr has this incredibly poetic, almost haunting description of the difference in these mindsets today. He notes that in the Islamic tradition, there are still contemplative Gnostics who can sit in a forest or by the sea, and when they hear the rustling of the wind or the chants of the birds, they literally hear the invocation, the dhikr, of God's blessed names.
They hear creation actively praising its creator.
But to the modern Western mind, which has lost that reflection of divine light due to centuries of nominalism and rationalism, that same wind and those same birds are just meaningless noise.
They are atmospheric vibrations and biological mating calls. Pleasant, perhaps, but completely devoid of any spiritual message. The connection has been totally severed.
And Nasr makes a profound point about the consequence of that deafness. Because humanity treats nature merely as an object to be pillaged for progress, nature hides her inner reality from us.
He uses the phrase that nature turns away from an avaricious humanity.
It is a chilling phrase, nature turning away.
It gives me chills because it feels so incredibly, urgently relevant to the ecological collapse and climate change we see on the news every single day.
It feels physically like the Earth is rejecting us. Which begs a really dark question. Does Nasser think we're just doomed? Are we completely locked into this path of environmental destruction simply because of a philosophical wrong turn the West took in the 14th century?
This raises an important question, and Nasser's conclusion is both a stark warning and a profound source of hope.
Hope, really.
Yes, he argues that nature's turning away is not a surrender. We should not look at our massive factories, our concrete channels, and our technological control and assume that we have permanently conquered the Earth.
We haven't won.
Not at all. The ultimate conclusion of the text is that nature will have the final victory.
But what does that victory look like? Is it just ecological revenge? The ice caps melting and washing us away?
It's deeper than that. It is the ultimate victory of truth and spirit over every form of materialism that tries to deny its reality. Nasr argues that quantitative science, despite all its spectacular successes in building our modern conveniences, does not have a monopoly on reality.
It hasn't disproven the traditional sciences, it just chose to put on blinders and stop looking at what they were studying.
Exactly. Going back to your intro, measuring the chemical ink of the love letter didn't magically erase the emotion of the words. We just forgot how to read.
Oh, that is so powerful. We just forgot how to read.
And Nasr makes an urgent plea to remember how to read. He urges us to realize that while quantitative science is powerful and useful, it can never replace the permanent, soul-nourishing knowledge provided by the traditional sciences of nature.
Because without that qualitative spiritual understanding of the world, human beings cannot ultimately survive on Earth.
We desperately need to recover that harmony with the reality that is the origin of both ourselves and the natural order.
So, if you take one thing away from this deep dive, let it be this core realization. The difference between Islamic science and Western science wasn't a matter of who had the better telescopes or who was better at math or who was objectively smarter.
No, it was a profound, world-altering fork in the road of human consciousness.
It was a fundamental choice between living in a universe of qualitative spiritual symbols that demand our reverence and living in a universe of quantitative mechanical facts that demand our control.
It is a history of what we chose to value and what we chose to discard in the name of earthly power. And seeing that history clearly, without the bias of inevitable progress, is the very first step toward understanding the crises of our own time.
Which leaves us with a final thought to mull over as we wrap up today.
What's that?
Well, if this mechanical clock view of the universe has indeed brought us to the brink of environmental and spiritual collapse, as the historical record suggests, what would a modern sacred science even look like today?
That is the big question.
Is it truly possible for us to unlearn our purely quantitative, exploitative perspective? Can we figure out a way to fuse the incredible empirical precision of the microscope with the profound spiritual reflection of the mystic's mirror before the clock finally runs out? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.